You've probably heard the claim by now. Your blood type reveals your bloodline, your ancient tribe, your true origin. Somewhere online, a video promises that if you're black and you carry type O blood, your DNA has just cracked open a secret about your ancestry that no history book could ever tell you. It's a compelling story. It sounds like the kind of thing that should be true because it feels true. There's something almost magical about the idea that a single letter on a lab report could unlock a hidden lineage stretching back tens of thousands of years. But here's the problem. It's mostly wrong. And the real story hiding in your blood is actually stranger, richer, and far more scientifically fascinating than the myth ever gave it credit for. So let's start with what people are actually claiming, because understanding the myth is the first step toward understanding the truth. The pitch usually goes something like this. Type O is the oldest blood type in human history. It supposedly belonged to the very first humans, the hunters and gatherers who roamed the earth before agriculture existed. And because type O is common among many people of African descent, the story gets stretched even further into the idea that having type O blood somehow proves a direct, traceable line back to a specific ancient population, a specific region, a specific tribe. It's presented as revelation, as if your blood has been keeping a secret from you your whole life, just waiting for someone to decode it. Here's the thing about compelling stories. They don't need to be true to spread. They just need to feel true. And this one spreads because it touches something real. For millions of Black Americans in particular, the desire to reconnect with African ancestry is not some trivial curiosity. It's the result of a historical rupture. Names were erased, records were destroyed or never kept. Family lines were severed by force, by the transatlantic slave trade, by centuries of a system designed specifically to disconnect people from their origins. So when something promises an easy answer, a biological shortcut back to a homeland that history tried to erase, of course it resonates. The desire is real. The need is real. The grief underneath it is real. What's not real is the science being used to fill that gap. Let's actually look at what blood type is biologically, because once you understand the mechanism, the myth falls apart pretty quickly. Your ABO blood type is determined by a single gene, just one gene sitting on chromosome 9. That gene tells your red blood cells what kind of sugar molecules, called antigens, to display on their surface. If you have the A antigen, you're type A. If you have the B antigen, you're type B. If you have both, you're type AB. And if you have neither, you're type O. The O version of the gene is actually the result of a small mutation, a deletion, that disables the enzyme responsible for producing those antigens in the first place. In a strange twist, being type O isn't about having something extra. It's about missing something that the A and B versions still carry. Now here's where it gets interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, because the O mutation isn't new and it isn't rare, and it isn't confined to any single group of people. Genetic research suggests this mutation is ancient, likely arising well over 1 million years ago, possibly even before modern Homo sapiens existed as a distinct species. That's not a typo. Some researchers believe variants related to the O blood type may predate our species entirely, meaning the mutation could have already existed in a common ancestor we share with other now extinct hominins. If that's true, then type O isn't a marker of one ancient tribe or one African region. It's a marker of deep time itself, something that was already present in the genetic toolkit long before modern human populations split apart and scattered across the globe. This is the first crack in the myth. If the O mutation predates the divergence of human populations, then it cannot possibly function as a fingerprint pointing to one specific place. It's not like a name passed down through a family tree. It's more like a very old tool that many different branches of the human family inherited, kept, and carried forward in different frequencies, depending on where they ended up and what pressures they faced. And that word, frequency, is the actual key to understanding blood type and ancestry, because blood type doesn't work like a unique identifier. It works like a percentage. Every population on Earth contains a mix of blood types. What differs is the ratio. Type O is common in parts of West Africa, yes, but it's also extremely common in Central and South America, particularly among indigenous populations. It's dominant in parts of Western Europe, especially historically among populations in places like Ireland and Scotland. It's found at high frequencies among indigenous Australians. In fact, type O is the single most common blood type on the entire planet, found across nearly every continent, every ethnic group, every corner of the globe humans have ever settled. So if someone tells you that type O blood proves a specific African origin, ask them this. Why is it also the dominant blood type among indigenous peoples of the Americas, who are separated from Africa by tens of thousands of years of independent migration and an ocean? The honest answer is that blood type frequency shifts happened locally, shaped by local pressures, long after populations had already spread out and separated from one another. It's not a snapshot of where you came from. It's closer to a record of what your ancestors, wherever they ended up, had to survive. So let's talk about what actually shaped those frequencies, because this is where the real science becomes genuinely fascinating, arguably more fascinating than the myth it's replacing. One of the leading theories connects blood type distribution to disease resistance, particularly resistance to malaria. Malaria has been one of the most relentless selective pressures on the human genome for tens of thousands of years, especially across sub-Saharan Africa, where the disease has been endemic for an extraordinarily long time. Researchers have found evidence suggesting that people with type O blood may have some degree of protection against the most severe, life-threatening forms of malaria, compared to people with type A or type B blood. The parasite responsible for the deadliest strain of malaria appears to interact differently with red blood cells depending on the antigens present on their surface, and type O cells seem to make it somewhat harder for infected cells to clump together in ways that lead to the most dangerous complications. If that theory holds, it would mean that in regions where malaria was a constant, brutal threat, people who happened to carry the O mutation had a survival advantage. They were more likely to live long enough to have children. Their children inherited the same protective trait. Over countless generations, in a region under that specific pressure, the frequency of type O in the population would climb, not because of a single unified ancient tribe, but because of relentless, repeated local natural selection acting on a mutation that had already existed for a very long time before that pressure even began. It's also worth understanding that malaria isn't the only pressure researchers have studied in connection with ABO blood type. Some studies have looked at possible links between blood type and susceptibility to other infectious diseases, including certain strains of cholera and even more recently some viral infections, where researchers noticed differences in infection rates or severity that seem to correlate loosely with blood type. The evidence for these other connections is generally weaker and more debated than the malaria research, and scientists are careful to note that correlation in a study is not the same as a settled, universally accepted mechanism. But the broader pattern holds up across this entire body of research. Blood type appears to interact with disease in ways that can quietly nudge survival odds up or down, generation after generation, in specific environments. That's a very different kind of story than tribe or bloodline. It's a story about biology responding to environment over and over in every population on Earth that faced its own unique combination of pathogens, climate, and diet. This is a profoundly different story than the one being sold in those videos. It's not about a hidden bloodline waiting to be decoded. It's about your ancestors, wherever they lived, adapting to the specific dangers of their specific environment. That process happened over and over again, independently, in different regions, under different pressures, which is exactly why type O shows up at high frequency in places as distant from each other as West Africa and the Amazon basin. Different populations, facing different but sometimes overlapping pressures, arrived at similar genetic outcomes. That's not a coincidence pointing to a shared secret origin. That's evolution doing what evolution does, shaping populations locally, over and over, across the entire span of human history. Now, let's talk about why this matters specifically when the conversation turns to African ancestry, and why the myth is not just scientifically shaky, but actually somewhat disrespectful to the real complexity of African genetic history. Here's something that often gets lost in these viral claims. Africa isn't one place, genetically speaking. It's the most genetically diverse continent on Earth by a significant margin. Human beings evolved in Africa, and modern humans lived there, diversifying, splitting into distinct populations, developing distinct languages, cultures, and genetic profiles for a vastly longer stretch of time than humans have lived anywhere else. Every non-African population on the planet descends from a relatively small group that migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago, which means non-African populations actually carry less overall genetic diversity than the populations that remained on the African continent. What that means, practically, is this. A claim like type O blood reveals your true African origin, treats Africa as if it were a single genetic monolith, as if one blood type could somehow represent an entire continent's worth of history, hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, thousands of languages, and tens of thousands of years of independent population movement, war, trade, migration, and adaptation. It flattens an extraordinarily rich and complicated genetic landscape into a single soundbite. And ironically, the same commercial DNA testing industry that sometimes pushes these narratives has been criticized by scientists for another related problem. Many of the genetic reference databases used by Ancestry testing companies were built primarily using European genetic samples. That means these databases are sometimes less accurate, less precise, and less able to pinpoint specific regional origins for people of African descent, exactly the population these myths claim to be revealing the truth about. The tools are, in some cases, working against the very story being told. Consider just how much genetic and cultural diversity exists within Africa alone. The continent is home to well over 1,000 distinct languages and thousands of distinct ethnic and cultural groups, spread across deserts, rainforests, savannas, highlands, and coastlines, each environment placing its own unique pressures on the people who live there. Populations in the Horn of Africa carry genetic signatures shaped by thousands of years of trade and migration connecting them to the Arabian Peninsula. Populations across the Sahel developed under entirely different agricultural and climatic conditions than populations in the dense rainforests of Central Africa. Southern African populations, including groups whose ancestors represent some of the deepest branching lineages in the entire human family tree, carry genetic diversity that researchers are still working to fully map and understand. Treating all of that as a single interchangeable category that one blood type could represent isn't just scientifically inaccurate. It erases an almost unimaginable depth of distinct human history. So if blood type can't actually tell you where in Africa your ancestors came from, what can? This is where the real science of ancestry testing comes in, and it's worth understanding, because it stands in sharp contrast to the blood type myth. Legitimate ancestry testing doesn't rely on a single gene. It doesn't rely on one trait like blood type at all. Instead, it examines hundreds of thousands, sometimes over 1 million, individual genetic markers scattered across your entire genome. These markers are compared against large reference databases built from real populations around the world, populations whose genetic profiles have been carefully documented and associated with specific geographic regions. Because this method draws on such an enormous amount of genetic information, rather than just one gene like ABO, it can do things blood type simply cannot. It can estimate percentages of ancestry from different broad regions. It can sometimes identify likely connections to more specific areas within a continent, especially as reference databases continue to expand and improve. It can identify actual genetic relatives, people who share measurable, specific segments of DNA with you, which is a completely different kind of evidence than a shared blood type that billions of people on Earth also happen to share. This is also why, if you've ever taken a mainstream Ancestry DNA test, you may have noticed it didn't even mention your blood type at all. That's not an oversight. Blood type simply isn't part of what these tests are built to measure, because on its own, it doesn't carry the kind of resolution needed to say anything meaningful about specific ancestry. There is one interesting, more legitimate use of DNA in the context of African ancestry specifically, and it's worth walking through because it shows both the promise and the real limitations of this kind of testing. Some specialized companies focus specifically on tracing maternal or paternal lineages back to specific ethnic groups within Africa, using something called mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, or Y chromosome DNA passed down from father to son. These companies build databases by collecting genetic samples directly from present-day populations across the African continent, cataloging genetic markers associated with specific documented ethnic groups. When someone submits a sample, the company compares that person's maternal or paternal genetic marker against their database, looking for matches. This approach can, in some cases, offer a genuinely meaningful connection, tracing one narrow thread of ancestry, either straight down the maternal line or straight down the paternal line, to a documented ethnic group or region in Africa. But it's important to understand what this actually is and isn't. It's not your whole ancestry. It's one thread out of what is, mathematically, an enormous and rapidly expanding number of ancestral lines the further back in time you go. Go back just a few hundred years, and you already have hundreds of ancestors, each contributing their own piece to your genetic makeup. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome testing only follows 2 of those countless lines, the strict maternal line and the strict paternal line. It says nothing directly about all the other ancestors who also shaped who you are. There's also a layer of honesty required here that these companies don't always emphasize as clearly as they should. Even legitimate scientists and bioethicists who study this field have raised real concerns about how confidently some of these results get presented to customers. A match to a documented ethnic group doesn't necessarily mean your specific ancestor definitely came from that specific group and nowhere else. It means your genetic marker is shared with people in that reference database today, because migration, intermarriage, and population movement have been happening across Africa for tens of thousands of years. That marker might also exist in other groups that simply haven't been sampled yet or weren't included in that particular database. So while this kind of testing can offer something emotionally and historically meaningful, something worth taking seriously, it's not the clean, definitive, singular answer that marketing materials sometimes suggest. It also helps to understand why mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA work so well for this narrow purpose in the first place. Unlike most of your genome, which gets shuffled and recombined every generation as it passes from two parents into one child, mitochondrial DNA passes down almost as a direct, unbroken copy from mother to daughter, generation after generation, with only occasional small mutations accumulating over long stretches of time. The same is true of the Y chromosome, passed from father to son. Because these two genetic threads mutate slowly and predictably, scientists can use them almost like a molecular clock, tracing a single line backward through time with a fair amount of confidence, at least for that one line. That precision is real, and it's part of why these particular tests can feel more convincing than broader ancestry estimates. But precision along one narrow thread should never be mistaken for a complete picture of an entire family tree that, mathematically, includes thousands of other ancestors whose stories those two tests simply cannot see. It's also worth remembering that these databases are living, evolving resources, not finished products. Every year, more African genetic samples get collected, more ethnic groups get represented, and match confidence improves. Researchers, geneticists, and historians studying the African diaspora openly acknowledge that today's results are a meaningful step forward, not a final word. So a result today reflects our current, still incomplete understanding, and future advances may refine, expand, or in some cases even revise what a specific match suggests. That evolving nature is a strength of real science, not a weakness. It's the opposite of a mythical, unchanging bloodline sealed forever inside a blood type. Let's step back for a moment and talk about why the type O myth specifically took off the way it did, because understanding the psychology behind it is almost as interesting as the biology itself. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We are drawn to stories that give us a clear, simple, emotionally satisfying answer to complicated questions. And few questions are more complicated or more emotionally loaded than the question of where do I really come from, especially for people whose family history was deliberately obscured or erased by historical violence. A story that says your blood type holds the answer is appealing precisely because it's simple. It doesn't require unpacking centuries of complicated migration patterns, disease pressure, population genetics, or the messy, incomplete nature of historical record keeping. It just says, look at this one thing, and you'll know. There's also a well-documented reason these kinds of videos spread so effectively online. Short, dramatic claims with a countdown clock, a mysterious tone, and a promise of hidden knowledge are built to grab attention in the first few seconds, which is exactly what algorithms reward. Nuance doesn't perform as well as certainty. A calm explanation of population genetics doesn't spread the way a bold, sweeping claim does. That doesn't make the people watching these videos foolish for being drawn in. It makes them human, responding exactly the way most of us respond to a story that promises to answer something deeply personal in a single, dramatic breath. But the real story, the one actually written into your DNA, is not simple, and that's not a disappointment. That's what makes it remarkable. Your genome is not a single key that unlocks one door. It's more like a layered map, built from hundreds of thousands of years of migration, adaptation, survival, and mixing between populations, some of it happening in Africa long before any humans ever left the continent, some of it happening afterward, as small groups spread out across every landmass on Earth and adapted to entirely new environments, new diseases, new climates, new food sources. Type O blood is a small but genuinely fascinating piece of that map. It connects you, in a very real sense, to an ancient mutation that predates modern humans as a distinct species. It connects you to the long, brutal, and ultimately adaptive relationship between the human immune system and diseases like malaria, a relationship that shaped populations across Africa and beyond for tens of thousands of years. And depending on where specifically your ancestors lived, it may reflect the particular pressures they survived, the particular environment they adapted to, the particular battles their bodies fought and won long enough to pass their genes forward to you. That's not a small story, that's an extraordinary one. It's just not the story being sold in a 60-second video with a dramatic voiceover and a countdown timer. So where does that leave you if you're Black, if you have type O blood, and if you're genuinely curious about where your ancestors came from? It leaves you exactly where anyone genuinely curious about their ancestry should start, which is with realistic expectations and the right tools. Blood type alone will not tell you that. It never will, no matter how compellingly it's marketed, because the biology simply doesn't support that level of specificity. What can tell you more, though still imperfectly, is broader genetic ancestry testing, ideally from a company that's transparent about its reference databases and honest about the limitations of its results, especially for people of African descent, where those databases are historically less complete than they are for people of European descent. Beyond DNA, there's also real value in combining genetic information with historical research, oral family history, and documented records where they exist, incomplete and painful as that documentation often is for descendants of enslaved people. Genetics can offer clues. It can offer probabilities. In some specific cases, through maternal or paternal line testing, it can offer a genuinely meaningful connection to a documented region or ethnic group. But it works best as one piece of a much larger puzzle, not as a single, all-revealing answer waiting inside a blood sample. There's something worth sitting with here too, beyond the science itself. The desire driving so many people toward these myths, the desire to reconnect with a lost origin, to feel rooted in something ancient and real, is not a desire that deserves to be exploited by oversimplified, dramatized claims, designed mainly to generate views and clicks. That desire deserves accurate information, presented with the same emotional weight and respect the question itself carries. The true story of human genetic history, and specifically the true story of African genetic diversity, is not less compelling than the myth. It's more compelling. It's a story about deep time, about survival against diseases that killed millions, about population movements spanning tens of thousands of years, about a continent so genetically diverse that it alone contains more human genetic variation than every other continent on Earth combined. So the next time you see a video claiming your blood type has just revealed a hidden ancient bloodline, you'll know what's actually going on beneath that headline. You'll know that type O is ancient, yes, but ancient in a way that predates any single population, any single tribe, any single origin point. You'll know that its frequency in different populations, including many populations across West Africa, likely has more to do with malaria resistance and localized natural selection than with some singular hidden lineage waiting to be decoded. You'll know that real ancestry testing relies on vast numbers of genetic markers spread across the entire genome, not a single gene responsible for a single protein on the surface of a blood cell. And you'll know that the true history written into your DNA is layered, complex, and shaped by tens of thousands of years of human movement and adaptation, which makes it, if anything, far more worth exploring honestly than any shortcut headline could ever capture. Your blood doesn't hold a secret waiting to be unlocked in 60 seconds. What it holds is a small, genuine fragment of an extraordinary, deeply human story, one written not in a single letter on a lab report, but across hundreds of thousands of years of survival, adaptation, and resilience. And that story, told honestly, doesn't need exaggeration to be remarkable. It already is. If there's one thing worth carrying away from all of this, let it be curiosity without the shortcut. Ask better questions than the ones a countdown video hands you. Ask which regions of the genome researchers have studied, which populations were included in a given reference database, and what a company means when it says match, likely, or probable. Real ancestry work rewards that kind of patience, and it tends to give back something sturdier than a headline ever could, a picture of where you come from that's grounded in evidence, honest about its limits, and still, in the end, genuinely worth discovering.